I would have to be speaking in a somewhat higher tone, but let me say, Pascal, my friends in the podium here, heads of international organizations, colleagues, Madam, it is a very great pleasure to be here with you to present the third OECD WTO monitoring report, Aid for Trade at a Glance, showing results. Very, very exciting, very encouraging, and I think very positive work of coordination. Because this is not all the story, this is called Strengthening Accountability in Aid for Trade. That means after 3 rounds now, we have learned something about best practices. We've learned something about the method. We've learned something about the discipline. We've learned something about where the really relevant issues lie, and the practitioners have been telling us, and well, we were able to produce this, which is as close as a manual, a toolkit that you can get to, and we'll be improving this one too over time. But the most important part of today's deliverables are Latin America and the Caribbean case stories, where of course we had the World Trade Organization, the OECD, but together with the Inter-American Development Bank and together with ECLAC, Global Review of Aid for Trade 2011 African case stories, where we had the African Development Bank and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, plus the usual suspects, the WTO and the OECD. And then Asia-Pacific case stories, snapshot of Aid for Trade on the ground with ESCAP and, again, the OECD and the WTO. So let me leave this here because they're going to drop on me here. It's there. Now, back in 2007, I presented the first Aid for Trade at a Glance report. Then, in addition to our global analysis, the report provided detailed information on the 7 developing countries that took part in the first monitoring exercise. In 2009, we returned and we had a much broader coverage of 85 developing nations. And now in 2011, we have based our analysis not only on an equally high level of participation, but also on 275 Aid for Trade case stories, half of which were provided by developing countries. That is, it was not just the organizations here that provided the stories, the countries themselves provided the stories, and that makes it more valuable and more useful. The report documents 269, but we got a few after the closing and the printing of the books, so those are also available if you're interested. The 2009 report argued that the international community needed to maintain momentum in the face of the Great Recession. The 2011 report shows that we did. The report paints a welcome picture of Aid for Trade contributing to better lives for women and men across the developing world. It shows how Aid for Trade is becoming a growing priority for an increasing number of developing countries and donors, and how Aid for Trade is being connected to the broader development agenda, with strategies and priorities increasingly focusing on competitiveness and trade-led economic growth. This development demonstrates a clear change in mindsets. We're not just building new roads or new bridges. We're witnessing a true economic transformation taking shape in the developing world. Now, in response to the Aid for Trade priorities, donors committed $40 billion in 2009. This translates to an average annual real growth rate of 15% since the start of the initiative. The share of the low-income countries and consequently sub-Saharan Africa has been steadily rising, as has the share of regional and global programs. Disbursements have been growing at a constant rate of between 11 and 12% for each year since 2006, reaching $29 billion in 2009. Donors are meeting their commitments on the aid for trade front. The outlook for aid for trade, and this is even perhaps more important, given the times, given the constraints on the budgets, the outlook for aid for trade is stable. Last year in Seoul, G20 leaders committed to maintain beyond 2011 at least the levels reached in the years 2006 to 2008. Some OECD countries are confronted with large budget deficits and find it difficult to respond adequately to the higher demand for aid for trade. Fortunately, continued growth of South-South cooperation can become an important complement to the support provided by the more traditional DAC donors. In any event, we should continue to make the case for more aid for trade by demonstrating its value, by demonstrating its usefulness. Taking steps to better measure results is essential if we are to show that progress is being made towards the development objectives of the Aid for Trade initiative. Last summer, Pascal and I jointly launched a call for the submission of case stories to probe deeper into the results of the almost $100 billion that had been spent on aid for trade between 2006 and 2009. We wanted to understand better the key ingredients of success or the shortcomings and what we could learn from the good and the bad experiences so far. In total, as Pascal advanced, we received 275 case stories from more than 145 countries, ranging from the smallest states, the Solomon Islands, Comoros, to the largest, such as China, and covering all major developing regions and income categories. Nearly half of them were submitted by developing countries, which emphasizes a potential for knowledge sharing. They revealed the rising importance of South-South cooperation, not only that of middle-income countries helping low-income countries, but also low-income countries helping each other. Collectively, the stories provide a wealth of information on the efforts by developing countries, the donor community, the private sector, think tanks, and NGOs to promote trade as an engine for growth and development. The sheer quantity of activities recounted in these case stories prove that aid for trade efforts are substantial across a wide spectrum of countries and are becoming more central to their development strategies. Although not always easy to attribute cause and effect, the case stories nevertheless show clear results of how aid for trade programs are helping developing countries build the human, institutional, and infrastructure capacity that they require to integrate into regional and global markets and benefit from trade opportunities. Many stories speak of demand-driven, technical capacity building programs that are helping countries define export-oriented growth strategies. Other stories highlight how aid has enhanced the capacity of trade officials to participate effectively in international negotiations, how this has helped them understand the implications of agreements and to perform in those negotiations and implement the agreements once they have been reached. A large number of stories detail how industry-specific programs address market failures to help the private sector better access foreign markets. Stories about aid programs that assist private companies in meeting international standards report successes about becoming part of global value chains. Accounts of trade facilitation programs and economic infrastructure projects, including regional corridors, describe how trade costs are significantly reduced and, of course, thus, more competitiveness. The case stories cite several factors which are critical for success. ownership at the highest political level, and active engagement of all domestic stakeholders, including the private sector and civil society. Long-term donor commitment and adequate and reliable funding. This has to do with predictability, not just the 1 year, but many of these projects last several years, and we need to know whether there's going to be funding in the years subsequent. Leveraging partnerships, including with providers of South-South cooperation. Combining public and private investment with technical assistance. And supportive macroeconomic and structural adjustment policies, as well as good governance, are vital for delivering the longer-term trade and development objectives of the Aid for Trade initiative. That means the context has to be conducive. You can find all of these stories on the joint OECD-WTO Aid for Trade website. They are merely the start of a learning process rather than the end. We need to undertake many more follow-up activities to understand better the results of Aid for Trade in different contexts and their wider applicability. Such knowledge sharing should address the question of how to better demonstrate that Aid for Trade is a worthwhile investment for improving trade performance, generating economic growth, and reducing poverty. This is the objective of the OECD publication, Strengthening Accountability in Aid for Trade. It provides good practices for strengthening results in Aid for Trade. In addition, it suggests that there is much to be gained from working together to measure progress towards partner countries' trade development targets. Such approaches will further strengthen country ownership, which is a critical factor in ensuring the effectiveness of Aid for Trade. Progress is being made in that respect. Not only have Aid for Trade flows been growing steadily, but Aid for Trade programs are also being delivered more effectively. Developing countries are demonstrating greater ownership, and there is clear evidence of broader stakeholder consultations. Donors continue to work towards harmonizing their procedures and aligning their support around developing countries' trade-related priorities. These positive findings are consistent with the conclusions of the recent evaluation of the implementation of the Paris Declaration. The challenges of delivering Aid for Trade effectively are indeed not unique, but they're part and parcel of the broader development effectiveness agenda. Improving aid quality and development effectiveness more broadly is not just an objective of the Aid for Trade initiative, but also of the 4th High-Level Forum on Aid Effectiveness, which will be held from the 29th of November to the 1st of December of this year in Busan, in South Korea. Aid for Trade will figure prominently in Busan, and we will showcase the initiative as a prime example of what can be achieved by applying the Paris principles on aid effectiveness. We will also use Aid for Trade to illustrate how aid can be leveraged to deliver development outcomes. Ladies and gentlemen, in return, we expect Busan to provide us with valuable inputs on how to improve further our aid management framework to achieve trade results. Equally, we expect Busan to show how we can further expand our efforts to build trade capacity, for instance, through new financing modalities and through knowledge sharing. We need to realize, however, that aid is only one source, albeit important in many cases, in the broader landscape of actors and approaches that support development. We need to welcome the opportunities that are presented by these different actors and approaches, and we need to work together to build on their achievements and innovations, some of which have been reported in these case stories and some of which are still waiting to be discovered. I hope that at the next global review, we'll be able to conclude that we have come one step closer to making the multilateral trading system more development-friendly and as Pascal suggested, that we have shortened the journey. Thank you very much.